Hello and welcome back to this video series entitled Why Hope? This is Season 1, The God Who Acts in History, and this is Episode 4. And I've entitled today's episode, He Laughs at Kings. Now I get this title from the words in Psalm 2. Let me read them to you. Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and his anointed, saying, Let us burst their bonds asunder and cast their cords from us. He who sits in heaven laughs. The Lord has them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. Now, I remember having a conversation with somebody once about this psalm, and they were quite disturbed at the idea of God laughing, and they thought he was laughing in amusement at cruelty at some of the injustices of this world, or indifference, and I don't think that's at all what this psalmist is talking about. I think the psalmist is showing us how the pretensions of kings, and when I say kings, I don't just mean people who've actually had a crown put on their head, but those who set themselves up as rulers, as governors, as authorities, those who set themselves up pretentiously, arrogantly, and God is amused at the hubris. He's amused at the arrogance. He's amused at the idea that these people could really stand against his purposes. I think that's the kind of idea that our psalmist is exploring here. Kings may strut on this little stage, but God laughs at their pretensions. Now, this is a theme that we see again and again in Scripture, and as before, I want to show you some of the places where this theme emerges. I want to start with Genesis 11. And Genesis 11, the story of the Tower of Babel, it's a kind of paradigmatic story. It's a story that tells us something about the later empires that come. Let me read you a few words from it, and then I'll show you what I mean. Now, the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as they migrated from the east, they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we should be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. Now, there's lots of discussion about what is it about the building of this tower that makes God decide to act to prevent it. And some have discussed the idea that it's the gathering together of people and the failing to spread out over the whole earth, which is something that God had instructed in Genesis 1, and I think there's something about that. Some have suggested it's this language of making a name for themselves. There's an arrogance here, and I think there's something about that as well. But it's unwise if we overlook some of the clues, some of the other clues in the text. So we get the language of Shinar, and Shinar in the Old Testament is associated with Babylon. We also get the language of bricks and mortar, and that is described in Exodus in relation to the forced enslavement of the Hebrews by the Pharaoh. So what we probably have here is an expression of an empire in its loosest sense, or in its broadest sense perhaps, a kind of hegemonic system which is uniting to oppress, with hints of Egypt and the enslavement there, with hints of Babylon, which was one of the great oppressive powers later on in the story of the Old Testament. Perhaps you can see why this is a paradigmatic story. And as you may well know, I'm not going to read it to you, but have a look for yourself. As you may well know, God acts against this tower. He acts to prevent it. And perhaps this is a story that reflects the same thing that the psalmist in Psalm 2 is reflecting. So where do we see this theme picking up later in the scriptures? Well, we encounter a lot of empires in the Old Testament and then going through to the New. So we encounter the Empire of Egypt, I've referred to that already. The Empire of Assyria. Now, I mentioned Assyria last week. Assyria was an expansionist empire based in, or with its centre in Nineveh, which is modern-day Mosul, and they were appallingly cruel, particularly in their treatment of prisoners of war and war captives. Terror for them was a weapon that they used to subjugate the peoples. If you live in the UK and if you've been to the British Museum, there are friezes there in the Assyrian section which show the treatment of war captives, and it is brutal. So we've got Egypt, we've got Assyria, then we've got Babylon. Babylon being the great empire that will ultimately conquer Jerusalem, will conquer Judah, and will take the people there into captivity. Later, between the Testaments, we get Persia, and then we get Greece. Well, Persia, we find Persia in the late parts of the Old Testament. Then we get Greece. And then in the New Testament, there is the Empire of Rome. And of course, empires haven't finished. Empires continue. We can think of contemporary empires, kind of literal ones, or almost literal ones, things like Putin's Russia. But we might also think about the empires of some of the great corporations, or even mini empires that people build, oppressive bosses, abusive systems. There are many, and we could explore that, and I'm going to leave you to think that through. In Daniel 7, we read the most extraordinary chapter that explores empire and explores this same theme of God bringing empire low and enthroning his king instead. So at the beginning of Daniel 7, it's a very odd and difficult to interpret vision. It's the same style of writing as we encounter in the book of Revelation. And Daniel has this vision of four beasts emerging from the sea. Now, in the style of writing that he's using, this is kind of code for the emergence of a world ruler. And each of these beasts is somehow kind of deformed. It's a kind of bastardized version of any animal that we know. There's kind of, got the wings of one, or the teeth of another, or the claws of another. It looks deformed and alien and disturbing. But even more disturbing is the fact that at least two of these beasts are described in terms that imply they are pretending to be human. One of them is picked up and propped up on its hind feet so it can stand up like a human. Another one is given dominion, and dominion is the particular gift that God gives to humanity in Genesis 1, verse 28. So these beasts, representing, as I said, world rulers, they are being described in Daniel as pretending to be human, pretending to be humane, we might say, with pretensions of kindness and benevolence and so on. But actually, Daniel is uncovering them as bestial, as if you like, a bastardization of the human image. And then in contrast to these bestial rulers, we see a son of man. And this son of man, this is Daniel's language for a human, but it's very significant that it actually says a son of man, which is, of course, the language that Jesus uses of himself in the Gospels, because he has Daniel 7 in mind. And Daniel sees a son of man being brought into the presence of God, described in Daniel 7 as the Ancient of Days. So the Ancient of Days is on his throne, a son of man is brought into his presence, and to him is given dominion. This is Daniel exploring that same theme that we saw in Psalm 2, that same theme that we saw in Genesis 11. And that same theme is the focus of two great songs in our Bibles. The first one is Hannah's song in 1 Samuel 2. Hannah is the mother of Samuel. She's about to become the mother of Samuel. Samuel is the kingmaker. He's the one who's going to anoint King David, who's going to change the story for the people of Israel forever. And as Hannah discovers her pregnancy, and as she celebrates the arrival of this great act of God, she sings these words. Well, I'll read it to you in a moment, but I want you to notice that at the heart of these words, we find this phrase: the Lord brings low, and he also exalts. He brings low and he also exalts. Now let me read you some of that song and pay attention to whom he brings low and whom he exalts as Hannah sings it. My heart rejoices in the Lord, my strength is exalted in my God. My mouth derides my enemies because I rejoice in my victory. There is no one holy like the Lord, no one besides you. There is no rock like our God. Talk no more so very proudly. Let not arrogance come from your mouth. Reflecting Psalm 2 almost, isn't she? For the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble gird on strength. Those who were full have now hired themselves out for bread, but those who were hungry are fat with spoil. The barren has borne 7, but she who has many children is forlorn. The Lord kills and brings to life. He brings down to the grave and raises up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low, he also exalts. He raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with princes and inherit a seat of honour. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world. Hannah is at once expressing God's sovereignty, and she's expressing the great coming revolution, if you like, where all will be inverted, where the proud and arrogant will be brought low, and where the meek and the humble and the afflicted will be raised up. And Hannah's song is reflected again in Mary's song in Luke 1. Mary has just discovered that she's expecting Jesus, and she sings these words. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but have a read of the whole thing for yourself. She sings this: The mighty one has done great things for me, and holy is his name. His mercy is for those who fear him from generation to generation. He has shown strength with his arm. He has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. He has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. And as Hannah sees this great move of God, which is going to change history for the people of Israel, and as Mary sees this great move of God, which is going to change history for the whole of humanity, they celebrate the fact that God is the one who brings down the pretensions of the arrogant and the abusive, who brings empires to nothing and raises up the meek and the lowly. There are, as I've said, many empires of our time, and some of them might lead us to feel a sense of loss of hope in these days. But this is a reason that we can still have hope, because we have a God who acts in history. The empires of Egypt, of Assyria, of Babylon, of Persia, of Greece, of Rome, they are no more. I want to finish by quoting 2 lines from the end of a marvellous poem by Malcolm Guite, and it's called Herod, and I'm going to put the link on the YouTube blurb. And at the end of this sonnet, Guite says these words: But every Herod dies and comes alone to stand before the Lamb upon the throne. And this is why we can have hope.